Hey gang, Voltie here, back with some more educational content. Today is going to be the first video after the Building a Better Sideboard video that came out a couple of days ago. We're going to be going over white sideboard cards. This is the first one of a series. We're going to go through all of Wooburg and then multicolored cards, artifacts and lands as well. So we're going to be talking about all of the standard white sideboard cards that you should own if you'd like to play white in 7-Point Highlander, as well as the pros and cons and when you should be using each of them. So let's get started. First things first, we have Burrington Forge Tender. So this creature has protection from red, so obviously you're going to be bringing it against the red decks. However, there's a couple of key notes on the real purpose of Burrington Forge Tender. I do see it show up in sideboards where it isn't really needed, and I do see it not showing up in sideboards where it really should be. Basically, if you're playing a creature combo deck, or if you're playing a creature-based combo that requires one of your creatures to survive, and that creature is especially small and susceptible to red removal, that is the main purpose of Burrington Forge Tender. So if, for example, you expect your opponent to try to cast Fury or Unholy Heat on your Nadu, Burrington Forge Tender can counter that, and obviously there's other ways you can do that. You can use Blue Elemental Blast, but if your creature-based combo isn't in blue, you won't have access to Bebs, and Burrington Forge Tender is a creature which does make it easier to tutor for, using any of the creature tutors that you're probably playing in your deck anyway. Deafening Silence is up next. This card is criminally underplayed in my opinion. If you are playing a creature-based deck and you are in white, Deafening Silence should be in your sideboard. It's as simple as that. There are a lot of combo decks in 7-Point Highlander, and at least 50 to 60 to 70% of them are based around casting non-creature spells. So Breach casts a lot of non-creature spells. All of the Bola Citadel decks cast lots of spells. Traditional Storm as well. Now there are some combo decks that this is going to be blanked by, that isn't going to have text. Nadu is probably the most obvious one at the moment, or Time Walk and casting infinite Time Walks. However, it does have enough equity that it realistically should be in your sideboard. Now, if you're a white deck and you're playing lots of cantrips, so if you're in Jeskai or Esper, for example, this is going to be a lot worse. However, its primary purpose is I'm playing creatures, I'm not playing that many non-creature spells, my opponent is likely playing a lot more non-creature spells than me, I'm okay spending a piece of cardboard to buy myself extra time. Next up we have Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares. Now these two are the stock creature removal spells. Swords to Plowshares is probably going to end up in your main deck, however there are definitely decks that play it in the sideboard, and Path to Exile is less likely to show up in your main deck, but obviously it is an option for your sideboard. The main purpose of these cards is when your removal suite in the main deck isn't set up to beat large creatures, or you simply aren't playing removal in your main deck, but you are playing white, and there are certain hate bears and certain creatures that are going to interact with your combo. So for example, if you're playing Breach and you have access to the 4 colors that aren't green, Swords to Plowshares might end up in your main deck, but it might end up in your sideboard. There are a bunch of creatures that stop you going off, or that make it much more difficult to go off. For example, Archon of Emeria and Thalia, some of the graveyard hate pieces as well. But otherwise, if you're playing a plow in your main deck and you're a little bit light on removal based off your colors, if you're Selesnya based most notably, you're probably a little light on interaction, and Path to Exile gives you an extra piece. The main distinction between the two is that if you are trying to apply pressure, Path to Exile can sometimes be better than Swords to Plowshares. If you expect that your opponent will play a large creature to block, and you need to remove that to get in with your creatures, Swords to Plowshares is probably going to buy them a full turn based off your combat damage output, where Path to Exile won't. if you are looking to trade as efficiently as possible and make sure that the resource game swings in your favor, you should be playing Plow. Next up, we have Cathar Commando. This is a 2-mana 3/1 flash with 1 mana sack to disenchant something. This is probably going to end up in the main deck of all of like the Death and Taxes decks. So if you're a white-based creature deck playing a lot of Hate Bears, or if you're playing Lurrus as your companion, this should be in your main deck most likely. However, I do think it's a potent sideboard card in some situations as well. If you need a disenchant that you want to be able to spend spare mana on, you have options like Seal of Cleansing and Cathar Commando, where you can play it on a turn where your opponent isn't doing anything threatening. You don't have to spend your mana on Counterspell, for example, but because your opponent might play an enchantment like Blood Moon and lock you out of your mana, you want to be able to have that permanent in play when possible, and that way you can check those permanents. That's the primary use of a sideboard Cathar Commando. It's usually going to be in something like Jeskai or Esper, but otherwise it'll probably show up in your main deck. Next we have Celestial Purge. For 1 and a white instant, we exile a black or red permanent. It does what it says on the tin. The main reason you would use Celestial Purge over something like Sanctifier and Vec, which we'll get to in a moment, is that you have instant and or sorcery based synergy. So if you have a Snapcaster Mage or a Dragon's Rage Channeler, then Celestial Purge might have a bit more equity there. It also comes up if you care about your own graveyard. Playing a Sanctifier and Vec is a little bit less hateful, but realistically you should be bringing in Purge when you expect to be trading resources with your opponent. You shouldn't be bringing it in to exile something like Archon of Cruelty or Atraxa, because you should be interacting with their graveyard at an earlier point. This is mainly for things like Blood Moon and Sheoldred the Apocalypse, Laelia, Broadside Bombardiers. So Celestial Purge is quite niche, and it doesn't really show up in sideboards very often. However, it has a pretty powerful effect, and the fail case is usually quite high. The floor on this card, if you're against a black and red deck, is that it'll kill something. So we have Containment Priest next. This is your classic anti-reanimator or sneak attack or show and tell. If your opponent is trying to cheat a creature into play, Containment Priest is your goal. The main times you would play Containment Priest is if your graveyard hate is a little bit limited. So if you can't play Rest in Peace because you need access to your own graveyard, or if you just want an extra copy of it, this card is quite powerful. It can also set up removal spells. So if you have a Containment Priest in play and you have a Philia or a Flickerwisp, you can remove one of your opponent's creatures and it won't come back. That's one of the applications, and that's sometimes why it might show up in the main deck, but realistically it is a sideboard card. And it's something to keep in mind that having a sideboard card that's dedicated to hating on a particular strategy with power, like with being a creature, means that you don't have a blank piece of cardboard while your opponent's spinning their wheels trying to find an answer. If you play a Rest in Peace, you've stopped them from doing their thing, but your Rest in Peace isn't applying pressure, and you might have spent 2 mana to buy some time. Next up is Doorkeeper Thrall. This stops artifacts and creatures from having ETBs. The main application of this is against Thassa's Oracle. It also helps against the initiative creatures. The reason that this is a very interesting sideboard card, in my opinion, is that white is one of the creature-focused colors in 7 Point, and a lot of the creatures have Enter the Battlefield triggers, so it's a very niche option. You don't really want to be playing it for value and turning off your opponent's Snapcaster Mage, because you're probably turning off more of your cards as well. However, if you specifically need to stop the initiative from becoming a mechanic in the game, if you want to be able to blank a Palace Jailer, and if you want to stop Thassa's Oracle, then Doorkeeper Thrall might be the option. Next up we have Ethersworn Canonist. There are a bunch of Rule of Law effects in the white sideboard pile. This is one of the more niche ones. Basically, each player can only cast one non-artifact spell per turn, but they can cast as many artifact spells as they want. So it's not a dedicated rule of law effect. However, it does show up for a couple of reasons. It's a human, and it's an artifact. So those are the two big things. If your artifact creatures matter, because you're playing things like Cranial Plating or Steel Overseer in Affinity, then having a rule of law be a Grizzly Bear with upside is pretty real. The fact that it's a human where some of the other rule of law creatures aren't does help with things like Champion of the Parish and Coppercoat Vanguard and Thalia's Lieutenant. And then obviously the kicker to all this is if you plan on casting artifacts, but you still need to hate on multi-spelling, then Ethersworn Canonist would let you get around that. Next up we have Get Lost. Get Lost is similar to Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares, however it does have other applications. If you're in white, it's possible that you would struggle to deal with Planeswalkers, especially large Planeswalkers. So Prismatic Ending is good against smaller Planeswalkers, however Minsc & Boo is quite difficult to Prismatic Ending, for example. Get Lost gets around that. It does also check enchantments, which is a bit of a free roll. Realistically, you shouldn't be playing this card in place of a disenchant. However, playing an extra, very versatile sideboard card in a slot where you kind of just want to have a removal spell that's all purpose, then Get Lost is pretty good. Hallowed Moonlight is next. This is very similar to Containment Priest, but doesn't come on a body, but in exchange you get to cycle it. And there are some other applications where it can hit tokens, for example. The main reason to play Hallowed Moonlight over other options, one is that it cycles, two, it can be rebought with things like Mystic Sanctuary and Snapcaster Mage, and three, you can't interact with it without interacting on the stack. So if your opponent counters Hallowed Moonlight, they could have countered your Containment Priest, for example, or your Nihil Spellbomb. But if you try to reanimate a creature and they play Containment Priest, you can kill the Containment Priest with your reanimation effect on the stack and get to keep your creature. So it narrows down the window of possible interaction, and if all you really care about is stopping this one big play and then continuing to apply pressure, then Hallowed Moonlight does have quite a lot of text. Next up is High Noon. This is one of the rule of laws that we're going to start going through. This one has explicitly rule of law on it. Each player can only cast one spell per turn, and then it has a minor kicker of being able to deal damage. The main reason to play High Noon is if you want exactly rule of law's text, and you need it to be as cheap as possible. So most of the time, Deafening Silence will do the job. However, if you need to be casting a lot of instants and sorceries at different points in time and you expect the game to slow down, then High Noon might be good enough. I wouldn't play High Noon in replacement of any of the other rule of law effects specifically for the damage mode. That is meant to just be a flavorful kicker if you get to that point in the game. Next is Hushbringer, which is very similar to Doorkeeper Thrall. It stops creatures from having Enter the Battlefield triggers, but in exchange for not having Flash, it has Lifelink, and it stops death triggers. So the fact that it doesn't have Flash means you can't get the first trigger, like you could with Doorkeeper Thrall. However, stopping death triggers is relatively impactful. There are a couple that will come up over the course of your games, and there are some creature-based decks that play a lot of like value with death triggers, and then notably as well, it stops Protean Hulk. So if you see a lot of Flash Hulk and you really want to be able to interact with that, you could play a Containment Priest and a Hushbringer rather than a Containment Priest and a Doorkeeper Thrall. Next up is Invasion of Gobekhan. I think this card is also underplayed. For 2 mana, you get a 3 life battle that has the Elite Spellbinder text. So you choose a card out of your opponent's hand, it gets exiled and they can spend 2 more to cast it. The main reason to play Invasion over something like Elite Spellbinder or Anointed Peacekeeper is the backside. So once you attack the Invasion for 3 damage, you get an enchantment, and at the end of your turn, you get to put a 1/1 counter on each of the creatures that attack this turn. That's really important in terms of sizing for mid-range creature battles, where there are a lot of creatures going back and forth. But the second line of text says that you can sacrifice the battle, or the enchantment in this case, and your creatures get hexproof and indestructible. As a freebie, on top of your interactive piece, and on top of your Suitor Anthem effect, this is an incredible line of text. The main reason that I really like Invasion of Gobekhan is that it's very flexible, you can bring it in a lot of matchups, and it should always have a fair amount of impact on the game when you play it. Next up is Kataki War's Wage. All artifacts have at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice this artifact unless you pay 1. There are a couple of reasons to play Kataki over something like Stony Silence. 1, you have a critical mass of artifacts in your own deck that have activated abilities that matter. For the most part, this is going to be in the form of equipment, but if you're spending a point on Skull Clamp, and you plan on getting your Skull Clamp every game, the Stony Silence is not ideal. The second reason to play Kataki is that it's tutorable. So if you're playing either of the Recruiters, if you're playing a Birthing Pod, if you're playing a Court of Calling, Kataki is an artifact hate piece that is much easier to get than Stony Silence is. But otherwise, picking which one of those two is kind of up to you. Next up is Lion Sash. It has the Scavenging Ooze text with a little bit of a flavor change. You can exile a card from a graveyard, and if it's a permanent, it gets bigger, and you can spend white for that cost. It's a little bit worse than Scavenging Ooze just because the life gain does usually come up. However, Lion Sash is a relatively important card to own for a couple of reasons. You can Stoneforge for it, and if you're in white, it's pretty likely that you're playing Stoneforge Mystic. It's an artifact creature, which comes up for, the various different affinity decks as well. And the fact that it gives you access to, eating away your opponent's graveyard while having a threat on board is not a very white thing. It's mostly a green thing. And so, nuking the graveyard is very easy for white, but getting incremental advantage and putting pressure on with Lion Sash is something that's relatively unique to the card. Next up is Mark of Asylum. So 2 mana for an enchantment, prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to creatures you control. This card is incredibly specific, and you should not put it in your sideboard unless you have a very particular goal in mind. However, if all of the control decks and all of the Wraths that you expect to face are red-based, this card can be incredible. Unlike Burrenforge Tender, this card is an enchantment which is a lot harder to get rid of, and if you expect your opponent to be casting Brotherhood's End, or Fury, or Anger of the Gods, this blanks all of those. It also has a lot of other niche upsides as well. It stops Renin 6 from pinging your creatures. It stops Orcish Bowmasters from pinging your creatures. It stops Walking Ballista from pinging your creatures. All of this for a 2-mana enchantment that is a blank in other scenarios. So it's very particular, and you should keep in mind not to overplay it. However, as a sideboard card specifically to keep your creatures alive, this card's pretty incredible, and I don't see it often enough. Next up is Rest in Peace. This is the grandmother of all graveyard hate. For 2 mana, you exile everything that's in the graveyard, and for the rest of the game, anything that tries to hit the graveyard gets exiled instead. This stops death triggers, this stops... it's mostly death triggers. But the fact that it eats the graveyard on entering the battlefield, it's very cheap to be played, and they have to remove it before they can do anything. Unlike some of the other graveyard hate options like Relic of Progenitus and Soul Guide Lantern and Nihil Spellbomb, you can play this and just forget about it, and once it blows up you can start reevaluating the graveyard situation, but otherwise it does what it does. Rest in Peace is the main reason to be in white when considering sideboard options. There are a lot of sideboard graveyard hate options across all of the colors, but none of them are quite as potent as Rest in Peace. The kicker to all of this is that most decks in 7-Point Highlander care about their own graveyard, at least to some extent. And so you have to be mindful of that during deck construction. How likely is it that I'm going to be drawing Rest in Peace? How likely is it that it's going to hit me for as much as it's hitting my opponent? Next up is Sanctifier and Vec. This is a weird blend of a lot of different effects. So it has protection from black and red, so it's really hard to kill. When it comes into play, it exiles all cards that are black or red from all graveyards, and then it has the rest of that text as well. So black and red permanents and black and red spells can't hit the graveyard. This is very, very specific because it hits things like Flage and Croxa and Troll of Khazad-dûm, but it doesn't hit things like Uro or a big card draw spell that your opponent then Mystic Sanctuaries on top. You have to be mindful of what you're trying to hit with your graveyard hate, and you have to be mindful of what it hits in your own deck. A lot of the white decks at the moment want to be playing Flage, and Sanctifier doesn't work with that. However, on top of all of this, you get a pro-black and pro-red creature, which is really hard to kill, and the fact that it is a creature does give it power to start attacking, and also makes it a little bit easier to tutor for. So keep that in mind. Most white sideboards should be playing a Sanctifier in Vec. Next up is Stony Silence. I've talked about this with Kataki. Basically, Stony Silence is Null Rod, but it's an enchantment and it's white. That's kind of it. It stops activated abilities of artifacts. It only really hits the dedicated artifact decks. You shouldn't be bringing Stony Silence in to beat Birthing Pod. But if it's turning off quite a lot of things and it isn't impacting you, it's pretty good. The fact that it's an enchantment makes it a lot harder to kill than Null Rod, which is an artifact, or Collector Oof, all of which have the same lines of text. Enchantment is by far the hardest card type to remove out of those options. Stony Silence is one of the other big sideboard cards for white, and you really should own one if you plan on playing white. Next up is Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. This card might look weird to some of you as being listed as a sideboard card. However, there are enough decks in the format that shouldn't be playing Thalia in the main deck that should be playing Thalia in the sideboard. A classic example is the Boris midrange deck that's been posted on the channel already. There are a lot of non-creature spells in that deck, and taxing them is really bad, especially if you run into an opponent that isn't playing non-creature spells. So if you play a Thalia and your opponent plays a White Plume Adventurer, you're in the hole and it's pretty bad. However, having access to that effect post-board against something like Breach is really game-ending. So realistically, if you can't put Thalia in your main deck, but you are playing a creature deck, Thalia might belong in your sideboard. Next up, we have Archon of Emeria. This is one of the Rule of Law effects that's on a creature. The other one being Eidolon of Rhetoric, and then Ethersworn Canonist to a smaller extent. Archon of Emeria has the upside of having flying and a real body. A 2/3 is not the easiest thing to kill, and it makes your non-basic lands that your opponent plays ETB tapped. So if they play a fetch lands, it comes into play tapped, and if they don't fetch a basic, that's also going to come into play tapped. Archon has a few downsides, and you might not always want to play it over something like High Noon or Deafening Silence. The fact that it's a creature does make it easier to kill. It's also decently expensive. At 3 mana, it's entirely possible that your Storm opponent or your combo opponent has already killed you, and having an Archon stranded in your hand can feel pretty bad. But otherwise, it's a really good card. It picks up equipment really well. It rumbles for the initiative and the monarchy really well. And so it's something to keep in mind. Next up is Eidolon of Rhetoric. This card is probably the worst of all of the Rule of Law effects. It's a creature like Archon, but it has a spirit tag which is about as useless as Archon. It's also an enchantment creature. There are very few ways to search for enchantments that are actually viable, that belong in decks that also search for creatures. So having Eidolon over actual Rule of Law isn't always going to be useful. I'll then talk about Rule of Law. I've talked about this a lot already, but this is the OG. 3 mana enchantment, each player can only cast 1 spell per turn. The main reason to play actual Rule of Law is that you need a second or a third copy of this effect, and you don't want it to be a creature. So most of the time you should be playing High Noon first, because it's cheaper than Rule of Law, and other than exactly Spell Snare, Rule of Law should be worse in every way. However, if you want a second copy of the effect, and you plan on casting and you don't plan on casting lots of creatures, so Deafening Silence is worse, and you want your Rule of Law effect not to be a creature, so it's less susceptible to removal, that's when you would play Rule of Law. Gideon of the Trials, I'll go back up to this. This is a card that I don't see enough, in my opinion. This card can single-handedly win a lot of combo matchups. If your opponent can't deal with a Gideon of the Trials in play because you can protect it with your creatures, or because they've got a bunch of creature removal but they can't actually deal with Planeswalkers, your opponent literally can't win the game. That's what its emblem does. The basic play pattern is that you'll play it, emblem immediately, and cross your fingers. If your opponent is going all in on a Thassa's Oracle line, they now have to spend time trying to deal with this permanent. If you have any way to protect it, either with Counter Magic in Jeskai, which is probably the most common one, or Red Elemental Blast in something like Boris, then, you know, the option, or the range of influence the card has is very narrow, in that if your opponent can deal with it, it's a complete blank, but if they can't deal with it, they're just dead. On top of all of that, as an anti-combo hate card, it also hits like a truck. Like, if you play it, emblem, it doesn't die, you can start cracking in for 4, and your opponent will simply just die. So it's something to keep in mind when looking at your sideboards. Lauren of the Third Path is next. This is a Reclamation Sage variant. For 3 mana and a medium-sized body, you get to destroy an artifact or enchantment, and then it has tap, you and target opponent each draw a card. There are a couple of reasons to play Lauren. If you care more about your card quantity, because you expect to be trading resources, but you also expect to be neutering your opponent's ability to play spells, then Lauren's third line of text is pretty good. On top of that, if you have Caracas or Flicker effects, like Philia and Flickerwisp and Guardian of Girapur and Restoration Angel, you can start blowing up lots of artifacts and enchantments. A lot of the white disenchants are either spells, or they're on creatures that sacrifice to disenchant something, like Cathar Commando. Lauren is unique in that it has an ETB disenchant effect, and, you know, it sidesteps a lot of that. The 2/1 Vigilance body doesn't really matter. The fact that it's a human does matter, so there's some pros and cons, but the card is fine. Sanctum Prelate. So when this enters the battlefield, you choose a number, and then non-creature spells with that CMC can't be cast. Sanctum Prelate is almost always going to name 1 to stop cantrips and removal spells. Sometimes it'll name 2 or 3 or 0 based off a particular combo deck the opponent is playing. It's a very niche card because a lot of the other white anti-spell cards are better than a 3-mana 2/2. However, Its effect is unique. There aren't other effects that actively stop someone from casting something. They might slow them down, or they might slow down the card velocity, like a Rule of Law effect. But Sanctum Prelate is okay. The last card is Triumph of St. Catherine. This is not a white creature deck sideboard card. This is very explicitly for a blue-white X control deck that doesn't have a lot of creatures, and the main purpose you'll be putting this in your sideboard is to get a Baneslayer Angel effect where you have a very large life-linking body, and you expect your opponent to have trimmed down or completely cut all of their removal spells, so the likelihood that it just sticks and wins the game is much higher. Triumph is probably going to show up in the main deck more than in the sideboard. However, there are a couple of reasons that you might not have it in your main deck, like you want to be reducing the amount of creatures and making sure that your opponent's removal spells are completely blanked, but it is something to keep in mind. Just don't put it in your white creature decks, basically. That's it for the white sideboard cards. There are obviously other cards in the color that can be played in your sideboard. However, this is a list of the ones I believe are staples, and at the very least should be considered whenever you're building a sideboard and your deck has access to white, or should be reasons to think about stretching your mana base to include white so that you can play these cards. But otherwise, that's it for this. I'll put a link to all of these cards in the description below. I'll also put a link to the Building a Better Sideboard video that I posted a couple of days ago, so feel free to go check that out. This video was brought to you with the help and support of my lovely patrons and sponsors. If you'd like to support me and my content, or if you just want to see your name on the screen, you can click the links below. If you like the content, please do consider hitting the subscribe button. You'll be notified of upcoming videos. It's free, it doesn't cost you anything, and it really does help the channel out a lot. But otherwise, I hope this was educational. I hope this was informative. Leave a like if you liked the video, and I'll catch you next time.